As you may already know, Leo Trotsky was alongside with Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, also known as Lenin, one of the leaders of the Russian Revolution, which for the first time in history established a government directed by the workers instead of the bourgeoisie. But when Lenin died on 1924, began a struggle between Trotsky and Joseph Stalin, who being at the top of the bureaucracy, managed to expel Trotsky from the USSR, sending him into exile in many different countries until he arrived here to Mexico on January the 9th, 1937 at the port of Tampico. Unlike other countries where Trotsky was pretty much an unwanted guest, here in Mexico, the president Lázaro Cárdenas even sent the presidential train to transport him safe from Tampico to Mexico City. And when he and his wife Natalia arrived here, they first lived during 2 years as guests in Frida Kahlo's famed Blue House, which is only a few streets away from here, until Trotsky and Frida's husband, the artist Diego Rivera, had a big argument and Trotsky had to leave. It was then when his secretary and bodyguard, Jan van Hayenort, found this place for them, which was property of an Italian family known as the Turatis, who used it only as a vacation house, since back then Coyoacán was still a small town in the suburbs. As a matter of fact, the highway over there used to be a river in those days, and that's why it's still called Rio Churubusco. The house originally consisted in the red T-shaped building and the watchtower in the bottom. But so that Trotsky could live here safe enough, they built an additional house for his Mexican and American volunteer guards to live in it. They built some additional watchtowers as well, and they made the walls higher. You will notice how the part made out of volcanic rock is the original wall, and the part made out of bricks is what was added to make it harder to break into the house. Those were the rabbit cages, and this structure used to be a hen's house. Eventually, the house was bought by the Socialist Workers' Party from the United States, so that Trotsky was able to move in on May the 5th, 1939. And now, in the pictures over there, is him feeding his rabbits and hens. Trotsky spent 2 hours every morning doing this, since he believed that any good revolutionary should be familiar with hand labor as much as with political intellectual work. This also gave him back some of the peace of mind that he barely enjoyed after almost 10 years of being pursued all around the world by Stalin's agents. When he was finished, he went back into the house, where he spent as much as 10 hours engaged in his political and theoretical writings. Next, in the guard's house, we will take a look at some pictures of Trotsky's life in the late days of the Russian Empire and the early days of the USSR. Well, in this first picture is him when he was 11, back when his name was Leiba Davidovich Bronstein, since Trotsky was only the name he used as a revolutionary in the underground. He was born on October the 26th, 1879, according to the old Russian calendar. That would be November the 7th in the modern calendar, in a small village in Ukraine called Janovka, nearby the port city of Odessa. And he was the son of a Jewish family, even though he later considered himself as an atheist, according of course with his Marxist philosophy. He got interested in politics because of an older cousin known as Monia, and as a result of that influence, here is him arrested when he was 18, already in trouble because of his early political activities. And this is him with Zinaida Bronsteina, his oldest daughter, from his first marriage with Alexandra Sokolovskaya. But when he was exiled to Siberia for the first time, this first marriage ended all of a sudden, and he then adopted the name Leo Trotsky, which some people say was the name of a jailer that let him escape with other prisoners since he came to sympathize with his political ideas. Of course, we cannot tell if this story is really true, but what we know for sure about it is that he used this name to be exiled in France on 1903 when he met Natalia Ivanova Sedova, his second wife. Here is again Zinaida, now grown up, with Trotsky's son-in-law, Plato Volkov. They are the parents of Sieva Volkov, the only one of his grandchildren who lived with him here in Mexico. Since back then in the USSR, a couple of Trotsky's grandchildren was kidnapped and banished by Stalin's regime. So to save Sieva, a French couple known as the Rosmers took care of him until they were able to bring him here to Mexico when he was already 13. He is, by the way, still living here in Mexico City, and he's now 89 years old. And here we know him by the name Esteban Volkov. Back then, Zinaida had left the USSR to get medical treatment for her tuberculosis. But when she arrived to Germany, she was told that she wasn't allowed to go back to the USSR. She had left there Plato, her husband, and the daughter from her first marriage. These family separations were so heartbreaking for her that she committed suicide in Berlin on 1933. Plato was arrested and died in Siberia on 1936. The pictures here are from the Civil War, right after the 1917 revolution. Back then, Lenin named Trotsky as the People's Commissar for the war and gave him the task to build the famed Red Army to defend the USSR against the invasion of 21 foreign armies that had banded together to form the White Counter-Revolutionary Army. Here is him on board of his armored train, on which he went back and forth through all of the USSR, organizing the defense of the country. And this picture here is from a time before that. This one is from 1907, during his second exile in Siberia, after the failed 1905 revolution, during which Trotsky was the president of St. Petersburg Soviet. He managed to escape the second time in the most amazing fashion, on a sled pulled by deers through the snow to meet Natalia in Finland, having the help of a native Siberian guide. Over here we have the famous Red Army hats, and amongst other pictures, the one here is particularly famous, since Trotsky was banished from it. Back then, many pictures were manipulated to erase any traces of Trotsky being close to Lenin, so that Stalin would appear before the workers' eyes as Lenin's natural successor. The relation between the three of them was very well portrayed by George Orwell's Animal Farm novel. You may recall the story of three pigs leading a rebellion against a farmer, and each one of them representing one of these characters. Old Mayor represents Lenin, Napoleon is Stalin, and Snowball, of course, represents Trotsky. You may also recall that when Napoleon expels Snowball from the farm, he finds Old Mayor's corpse in the farmer's butchery and makes his skull to be set on top over the entrance of the yard. I personally believe this represents Lenin being mummified, since even Lenin's widow, Krupskaya, bitterly protested, assuring that her husband would have never wanted to become an icon that would be used to manipulate the feelings of the workers. And now, in the map over there, we will see Trotsky crisscrossing all around the world. As you know already, the February 1917 revolution tried to transform Russia into a federate republic. That's why Lenin been exiled in Switzerland and Trotsky been exiled in New York City after having been expelled from France. They rushed to get back to Russia to participate in the October Socialist Revolution. But by 1928, Stalin had already full reign of the Bolshevik Party and managed to expel Trotsky from it, sending him to Alma-Ati in the former Soviet Republic of Kazakhstan. When he was taken the Soviet citizenship away from him, he then got refugee in Principe Island in Turkey, in the stretch of the Bosphorus, nearby Istanbul. And when the house he lived in Turkey was set on fire, he then fled to France, where on 1933 he began building the Fourth International to oppose Stalin, who had already corrupted the Third International funded by Lenin. Trotsky also believed that the Third International had failed in preventing Hitler from rising to power in Germany. He believed that in the early 30s, an alliance between the German Social Democratic Party and the Communist Party would have been strong enough to stop the Nazis, but Stalin purposefully frustrated that alliance. Back then there was a huge union strike in France. He got again deep in trouble and next went to Oslo, where the Norwegian government was so afraid of Stalin that they kept Trotsky arrested in his house until this became unbearable and they put him on an oil ship and not telling him where he was heading to. He even feared it would be a trap and the ship would sink in the middle of the ocean. But before leaving Europe, he learned that President Cárdenas had offered him asylum due to the intervention of Diego Rivera and the Mexican Trotskyist Octavio Fernández, and even after Franklin Roosevelt had denied him asylum in the United States. Here is him fishing in Norway, him fishing in Turkey, and him with Natalia and Leo Sedov in Kazakhstan. Over here are them in France, and this is their family tree. His parents, David and Anna Bronstein, were formerly farmers who became merchants. His younger sister, Olga, married Kamenev, another important member from the Bolsheviks. With Alexandra, they had Sinaida and Nina, who married Matt Nevilson, who died in Siberia in 1938. She had died 10 years earlier from tuberculosis when she was denied medical care in Stalin's USSR, and it was their children, Leo Nevilson and Bolina Nevilsona, the ones who went missing. Alexandra looked for them desperately before being exiled herself to Siberia, where she died. With her first husband, Zakhar Moglin, Sinaida had a girl, Alexandra Moglina, who was sent to Siberia being still a little girl, but managed to survive and died in Moscow until 1989. Sieva, known in Mexico as Esteban, married Palmira Fernández, an exile from the Spaniard Civil War, and they had 4 girls together, Susana, Nora, Natalia, and Patricia. Nora is now in the United States, a well-acknowledged neurobiologist who leads cutting-edge research on addictions. With Natalia, they had Leo and Sergei Sedov, who stood in Moscow, confident he would be safe as long as he didn't get involved in politics. Nonetheless, Stalin made him to be executed on 1937. Leo was Trotsky's right hand in the Fourth International, and he was poisoned while recovering from a surgery in a hospital in Paris on 1938. Sergei's daughter Julia was exiled in the United States, and Leo Sedov Jr. vanished without leaving any traces, being possible he may have changed his identity to be safe. Well, now I would like to show you the house in which Trotsky lived the last year of his life. The last year